Hello, and welcome to Real Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager. I'm pleased to have with me back on the show today Autumn Edwards. Welcome to the show, Autumn.
Hello, Angela. Thank you for having me again.
And Autumn is our resident Asian cinema expert here in Salem, Oregon. Yes, with quotes, she likes to put that around there. And today we are going to talk about the Japanese auteur. Um, I was going to try to say the first name, and then I got nervous. Nobuhiko
Nobuhiko Obayashi.
Obayashi from 1938 to 2020. So he passed away pretty recently, focusing on his earlier films. Obayashi, a really interesting filmmaker, most famous for a cult movie called House, which some of you might have seen. Most people have not seen the many, many other films he did. And so I'd like you, Autumn, to talk about a little bit about Obayashi, why you think his films are important, and why many people, particularly in America, are not aware of his movies.
Mhm. So Obayashi started his film career at the age of 6 with his first 8 millimeter film that he made, which was like a hand-drawn animated feature called Popeye's Treasure Island. He eventually went to school for film and graduated and started directing commercials right out of school. But even within those commercials, you could feel all of Obayashi's, quirks and his singular aesthetic and everything in there. And then eventually he made House, which is, this extremely singular thing that blew up eventually in the West here, and is kind of most people's idea of what Obayashi is. But he's got so much more to him than just House. While that is a great example of, all the signposts of what we would look for in an Obayashi film, he has a lot more depth than most people give him credit for. And even within House, there's a lot more depth there beyond the candy-coated surface. And so I think part of the reason that he's underappreciated here in the West, at least, is because of that surface. House is such a singular film, and Obayashi such a singular presence that people get blown away by this one thing, and then it kind of just becomes their idea of what he is. It becomes an emblem. But he has directed dozens and dozens of pictures, thousands of commercials. He's written radio plays, and he's done comics and other things. So he's just an extremely varied artist. And I think that he deserves his credit, beyond just this one film. So
Why do what is it about his films that you think really stand out and put him at that level of the great Japanese masters like Ozu, Kurosawa, etc.?
mhm. I think it's his clarity of vision more than anything. Right, I said he's a very singular presence. You watch any one of his movies and you immediately know it's an Obayashi movie. And while that can be said of lesser artists too, because auteurism is this hot thing and everyone likes to put their own stamp on this, Obayashi has a real uncynical clarity of vision that I find very appealing. He's just like a very pure person, and he channels that into all his films very well. All his films have just like a wonderful energy and spirit about them. They all have a great humanitarianism about them. I think that he really is just like no one else. You can tell he just loves everything that he's doing, and he's so in control of the tools at his disposal. I feel like he's using everything that cinema has to offer. While some people might be a little more trepidatious about taking some of the bold choices that he does, but he charges right in, and I really appreciate that.
He's not afraid to be weird, which I really love about his films. He uses music
Mhm.
well. His films are very stylized. So if you don't like stylized films, you may not like them, but I love that. And they're comedic often, not always, but there's often moments of comedy. And I think that's probably one of the reasons he's not as well regarded in the US, or not as well known. Um,
Mhm.
uh, you know, Drama often gets overemphasized over comedy, and directors that use comedy, and in his case, sometimes even slapstick, are often overlooked. And on top of that, he focuses on youth, young people in his films, is another audience that's often overlooked. So I think he's in some ways sort of opposite of Ozu, right? So in that
Hmm.
way, so who tended to have focus on a lot of older people and has films that are very, quiet and meditative and introspective, which is not the Obayashi way.
Not at all.
So yeah, anything else you'd like to add before we jump into some of the movies?
Um, I think that I just want to add that he's really cinematically literate and like musically literate. I love, like you said, the way he uses music in all his movies. I feel like every time I watch one, I have whatever melodies were playing in that stuck in my head for days after, and I find myself just like humming them randomly.
Hmm.
And he's just always like constantly throwing in references to like other great directors or great movies or this or that. And you can just like feel that he's someone who really knows his craft. And I love that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we are going to talk about House, but we're going to try to not focus on it because of the fact that part of our goal here is to introduce our audience to some other Obayashi films. And so we're going to start with House because we're going chronologically. This is going to be the first of 3 episodes on Obayashi because he has that many films that are unexplored. Let's start with House from 1977. Of course, this is his most well-known film and also his first studio feature film. And it is about a group of young girls, teen girls, who go to the main character. Her name is Gorgeous, and they go to Gorgeous's aunt's house out in the country for a little vacation, and find that the house has a lot to offer them and a lot of surprises in store. The house is possessed, and slowly, one by one, sort of picks off each girl. But it actually takes a while for that to happen. So the beginning of the movie is very like innocent fun. These girls are just like happy and having a good time and giggling a lot. Kind of introduces us to the 2 primary girls, Gorgeous, whose mother has died and is very upset and has in fact planned this trip in part to get away from the fact that her father is planning to remarry and she's going to have a new quote unquote mother. And then Fantasy, which is her best friend. All the girls have names kind of like this. One is Prof and Mac. So they have names that are sort of like their personalities. And then, of course, Blanche, my favorite character, which is the demonic cat. And of course, what this movie is famous for is its visuals. So it has all these kind of just like, you know, crazy like animations and CGI and a piano eating someone and things coming to life throughout the house and a chandelier that works on its own. So it's like the house is alive essentially. And Obayashi just has a lot of fun with that. But what I found really interesting on my recent viewing is that it also has these really deeper meanings that I don't think come out when you first watch it because you're so just enamored with all the zany visuals. The fact that the aunt has lived in this house alone because her love of her life died in the war, and so she's kind of just sitting here waiting for him. And that these young people then become devoured by this house. So this idea of being trapped by the past or by memories, I thought was very interesting and much more poignant, especially at the end this time. The ending is actually a little bit sad, and you're not expecting
It's
that,
very
especially where
sad.
you
Yeah.
start in the movie with it being so happy and light.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
your
you
thoughts?
feel when you're really looking for it and you're actually listening to what the people are saying and like taking cues from, the subtle clues of the movie, you really feel the oppressiveness of the war and like its fallout on all these characters here, right? Like the aunt is, she's stuck here living in like this house that's become like a prison for her because, her partner died in the war and everything, and it's made her bitter, and now she, needs to consume the vitality of the young who have been unaffected by the war. It is very sad, like you said in the end, but it's hard to tell maybe right off the bat with all the candy coated everything.
Oh yeah, and especially at the beginning, you don't think it's going to go there.
Hmm.
So, I think you made a comment once that it's also like an anime brought to life or
Hmm.
manga comic or whatever. It's really
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it feels like a very like true adaptation of a manga. It really maintains like the spirit of it, even in terms of like just how it cuts, how the thing moves, the zaniness, the color and everything. It's all just over the top in a very awesome maximalist way.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, well, it's definitely a classic. You've got your house shirt on. You want to make sure the audience
Yeah.
gets to see that. That's from the movie, right? Did
Hmm.
you get that in Japan or did you
No, I
order
didn't get
that
this in
here?
Japan. I actually got this from a shop called Superyaki online. But yeah, I would
Very
love to
nice.
visit Onomichi, like Obayashi's hometown in Japan someday, because
Oh, I
he's
know it looks
commemorated that in many
beautiful.
of his
Yeah,
films. Yeah, we'll talk about that a
yeah,
little bit later, I'm sure.
yeah. Okay, go. Let's move on to our next film.
Yeah, so our next movie is called School in the Crosshairs, also called The Aim School. This one is another adaptation of, I believe it was a short novel. This one stars Yakushimaru Hiroko as Yuko. Hiroko was a teen idol, and this was something that Obayashi did a couple times throughout his career. He worked with studios and teen idols to make these teen idol films. It was like a whole genre of thing. But what I find impressive is that even within that, he's like he doesn't feel like he's given dictums by the studio, right? Like even though he's using their idols and I'm sure he's acquiescing to their demands, everything feels like an Obayashi film through and through, no matter what, just because he has his hands on it. But I digress. Anyway, Yuko is a high school girl who must defend her school from an extraterrestrial invasion using her newly discovered telekinetic powers. A new transfer student is using her own abilities to brainwash other students into following a fascist leader who is actually the embodiment of the universe itself. So Yuko has to team up with one of her friends, Koji, from the Kendo Club to fight off the invaders. It's super cute. It's super fun. Not close to a love story, but not quite. It's not like really consummated per se or anything, but there's a cute, crush situation between the two main characters. I love the fascist themes and these kids fighting against fascism very literally. I appreciate that it's on the nose. It's not trying to be subtle about it. They literally dress up kind of like Nazis when they're being converted and everything. But this just speaks, I think, to the personal nature of the film at the same time, because Obayashi was greatly affected by the war himself. Like I said, his father was an army doctor who was called off to the war, and so Obayashi was raised by his grandparents in his infancy. So Obayashi has been very affected, and he's very anti-war, and you can see that in all his films. House, School in the Crosshairs here, and eventually he has an anti-war trilogy, which is phenomenal. We'll go over later. But I really enjoy this movie. It's just like a beautiful representation of youth and like the freedom and that kind of wonderful vivacious spirit that kind of youth represents, and
Mhm.
kind of the fears of growing old and having that die out over time, and having life put you in a prison of some sort.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It was my first non-house film, so like a lot of Westerners, I have not before I met Autumn, I had not seen any Obayashi films except for House, which I had seen. So I was really eager to dive in and see what else he has to offer. So this was the first one I watched, and it's a lot of fun. Like you said, I didn't the story is absolutely off the hook. It's just it's with the fascist kids coming in. But I love that it also just it's fun because they have these these powers that both of them have to control minds, and there's
Hmm.
some really funny kitschy scenes. They're like especially where they're like zapping their eye lasers at each other and
Yeah.
stuff that you would expect. But then there's these deeper resonances. The school at first really embraces these kind of fascist teens taking over this
Hmm.
girl who comes in because they're like, yes, we need discipline and order, and these kids are getting too crazy. And then they start to see the flip side of that, which is that the fascist teens everybody starts getting in trouble, and everyone starts getting imprisoned, and it starts to get too strict, which I also think is probably a little bit of his commentary on the direction Japan was heading. This very
Hmm.
or had always been like in a way, right? With their military and everything, this very like discipline oriented, rule structured
Hmm.
society that doesn't allow for individual freedom. So getting back to what you said, one of his common themes of individual freedom and creativity and people being able to make their own choices, I think is really important here.
Yeah.
Uh, Although it's also interesting that at the beginning she's kind of just using her powers to like help this cute boy, with like
Yeah.
winning his
Classic kid
tournaments.
stuff though, like why wouldn't
Yeah,
you use it for your personal gain when you're a child, right? Like,
yeah, right.
yeah,
Yeah, so he can win his tournaments, which at first I was like, this dork doesn't deserve you, girl. But
I know,
anyway, so
yeah. But I
but
just
yeah,
love
it's a
how
fun
much heart
movie.
is in this movie, right? Like
Yeah.
it's so full of love for its characters and the world that it creates and everything. And it's actually like for me, like it's surprisingly poignant. Like every time I watch it, I get really emotional when she confronts the universe and is like, "I will fight you." She straight up says like, "I will fight the universe." Like then, and I'm like, that always like almost makes me tear up. I'm like, it's just a beautiful stand that she's taking. It's just like fighting for life and freedom. It's just, I don't know, it's a
Mm.
beautiful moment.
Yeah, it's a really great film, and definitely encourage people to seek that one out.
Hmm.
So we should probably move on to our next one, which I know is one of your favorites.
Yeah. So the next one is Miss Lonely. This is the story of a boy named Hiroki who meets and falls for a younger version of his mother. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's less weird in the movie. His father is a Buddhist monk. His mother is a nag. He spends his time messing around with his friends and doing silly things like spirit photography. He feels like his life is basically already laid out for him, and he's just going to follow in the footsteps of his father. So, kind of continuing that thread from School in the Crosshairs of like, the oppressiveness of the future and how that comes in and like, squashes the children's hopes and dreams. But I really enjoy this one. I think it's very lighthearted. It's much more reserved than either of the other two we've talked about it stylistically. There are like no real crazy effects that I can recall off the top of my head. It's shot very beautifully as well. I think it's one of his most beautiful films. It's just bathed in these golden ambers the whole time. It's extremely nostalgic. And I really love it as like an elegy for a time, a place, and like, people, particularly like a time and a place within people, because we become so many different people throughout our lives. And so this is just kind of like holding up a time and saying this was a beautiful moment. It's worth commemorating, and we may move on, but we should still appreciate it.
The two different version or three versions really of his, I mean his, so there's actually two versions of his mom. There's the ghost version that comes back from, and then the girl he's admiring from afar that he has a crush on, who's also, yeah, so there's these versions of his mom, which, yeah, like you said, it sounds creepy, but it's not as much. It's more like the fact that he feels very disconnected from his mother because she's nagging him all the time about his homework, and this experience that he goes through kind of brings him closer to his mother. So in a way, it's very
Hmm.
kind of beautiful in that
It spurs
perspective.
a
His
lot of
dad,
self-reflection.
yeah, although his dad is very, it's also very, this one is, I think, very slapsticky, especially with him and his
For
friends, because they're
sure.
just,
Yeah.
there's the ongoing gag of the one teacher whose skirt keeps falling down. And
Yeah.
then they have this, they teach the parrot how to sing, that's in the principal's office, how to sing a
Hmm.
naughty song so that the parrot starts shocking people. So there's a lot of little Obayashi like gags throughout the
Hmm.
film. It is more serious, like you said, than some of his other films in terms of less visual shticks. The only one that I noted was when they're cleaning out the temple, and he lives in this really, which is actually a real famous temple that in the town that Obayashi's from. He lives in the temple with his family, which also must be a little bit of a weird thing for a kid to like grow up in a temple. But they're cleaning
Hmm.
out the temple, and he's got the box of photos, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the photos all just start flying in the air, and they rearrange themselves and scatter. And so that's kind of the only visual trick I could think of in this film that's
Hmm.
kind of a little
Yeah.
bit more like anime. And then his one friend who does somersaults all the time, but I think he's
Yeah,
actually
I
really
wanted
doing
to talk
this.
about that. I really love the cast in this one. I think Obayashi always has great casts, but I feel like these kids were like so wonderful. They really just feel so uninhibited. They're not worried, like, and self-conscious with the camera on them. I feel like they could very easily be locals.
They
They're
seem like
very,
real kids. I mean, they seem like kids that
yeah,
could have already been friends together. Like the boys have
absolutely. Their rapport
that
is
kind of
great.
joshing around, the way the boys kind of interact
Hmm.
seems like how boys would actually interact,
It's a
like it
really
doesn't seem put
wonderful,
on.
fun rambunctiousness that they all have. I mean, the
Yeah.
physicality to all their performances, I think, is super wonderful here. I also really enjoy, again, like I just want a little thing here. I love the way music connects people in this one, right? They all talk about Chopin's Farewell, and because it's a song his mother loved, because this boy that she loved played it well, and so she tries to teach it to her son. And so this piece of music and kind of music in general connects them all. And I think this is beautifully demonstrated, particularly through one scene where the boy is kind of starting to play Chopin's Farewell. His father is in the room next door, just kind of beating away on the wooden Buddhist drum, and they eventually come into harmony together, and like the drum becomes melodic with the piano, and then his mom is in the other room and she starts humming, and so the song just connects them all together, and I think it's a really beautiful moment, and again, very personal to Obayashi, who clearly loves music. He puts a piano in every single one of his films. They're always very prominently featured, and I love that. This one also,
I hadn't thought of that about before, the fact there's always a piano in every film. Yeah, the
yeah.
Chopin farewell is the connecting element in the movie and very
Hmm.
obviously emphasized, which I told my husband about. I found that really interesting. I have
Hmm.
to say, I gave this one a little lower review than some of the other films, and so don't freak out because I know you love this
Saw
one.
that. It's
I
okay.
did not, I kind of missed some of the stylistic aspects. And I maybe because it's focused on a boy versus often his films are focused on girl, female characters more.
Mhm.
Maybe there was something with that. But the other thing, I don't know if I loved the photography style as much as you did. I found the very yellow look to it. It kept making
Mhm.
me think of this John Huston movie I reviewed years ago on the show called Reflections in a Golden Eye, which where he decided to shoot the whole movie in yellow with a yellow overcast. And I thought it was a
Mhm.
really bad decision. It gave me reminiscences of that. It's not as yellow as the John Huston film, but I wasn't I think he's going for this kind of yellowish thing to give it that nostalgic feeling. And
Mhm.
sometimes I felt like it worked in certain shots better than in others, but I like visually a lot of his other films I've seen so far better
I
than this
wouldn't
one.
mind maybe a little less intensity there. I'll agree with you, but I think compositionally, it's like absolutely wonderful. You see the way he blocks his characters and frames his shots. It's very because it has that slower pace than his other films. I feel like the compositions speak a lot more than a lot of his other ones that just move so fast.
I know. Maybe I got used to the fast moving and I was feeling impatient because I found myself getting fidgety during this one, and I hadn't felt that in any of his other films I watched. So, because I watched other
Also,
ones
this
that we're
is
not reviewing.
this
So,
is like maybe kind of a stretch and a little random, but I love for me every time I watch this, I think of Vertigo. I think of
huh.
like the way that he tries to like recreate a woman and stuff, and like it's just about the obsessions, the things that we love, how they drive us to recreate them, and how we get stuck in these loops, and how like you know I don't know, it's very esoteric and it's kind of ambiguous, but it reminds me of Vertigo, but a lot sweeter and more like loving towards the mutable and impermanent nature of people rather than like obsessively trying to
Well,
keep
and
them
it's
in
not as
that.
cold. It's not as
Yeah,
cold as you, and which we talked about recently when we got together. Is one thing about Obayashi, he's a very warm director. I don't know if he knows how to make an austere, cold film.
yeah,
And
not
again,
at all.
Hitchcock is an austere, cold filmmaker. He's almost the opposite. It's harder for him to be warm in the way that it's almost hard to imagine an Obayashi film that feels cold. And
Hmm.
so every character in this movie is likable. Even the PTA board president, who's made to be a joke in the movie, is really
Hmm.
funny and a comical character. But everyone's likable. The kids are all likable. The mom I found likable. She's supposed to be a nag, but she's really just. I felt sorry for her. She's got this husband that sits there and beats on a drum all
She's
day. I
a
mean,
nag from the child's perspective is the important thing, is it's taking his
right,
point of view,
right.
right? So he sees
But I
these
felt
people.
bad for her because you see the husband doesn't
Yeah.
pay any. Is not engaged at all with his kids, so it's kind of
Yeah. I was gonna say I enjoyed that. Like it really takes a subjective view where he is a little bit flattening the people in his lives into these characters, right? They become like just very easily definable characters to him. And he kind of learns over time though that that's not the case, that people are deeper than that, and he needs to like, engage deeper.
yeah. And it's also interesting. The movie's called Miss Lonely, but throughout the movie, he calls her Lonely Heart instead. So I also wondered
Hmm.
if that was a
It's
translation
probably just the
thing.
translation thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if it's actually called Lonely Heart in the original Japanese, but
Hmm.
hard to know. These are all hard to find. Although Miss Lonely is on Internet Archive for those people who
Hmm.
follow that. Okay, so we'll move on to their next film because I definitely want to make sure we have time to talk about this one because this was one of my
Hmm.
favorites. His
It's so
Motorbike,
good.
Her Island from 1986. And this is a romance film. It's also based on a novel, and it stars. I'm not going to, you know what? I'm not going to try to say his name. It's a young play about a young man who is a motorbike enthusiast, to say the least, who is
Hmm.
really in love with his motorbike, if we will, and he falls in love, or he falls for a young woman after teaching her how to ride, and then she becomes really obsessed with motorbikes as well. So I think that's really the plot. It's a very simplistic plot in a way.
Hmm.
And then there's a few other characters, including his best friend, and then this girl he used to date, that he kind of dumps in a really horrible fashion, who because he says all she wants to do is cry and cook, which I just love that line
It's
so much.
funny.
He's like, she's such a basic girl. All she does is cry and cook. And I was like,
The
well, one out of the
essentials.
two isn't bad. So anyway, but he's in love with this Kawasaki motorcycle is really what he's really in love with until he meets this girl who kind of challenges him because she doesn't just want to be a passenger, she wants to ride as well, which I love this aspect of it.
Hmm.
Stylistically, I love this film because he switches between color and black and white throughout, and there's no seeming rhyme or reason to it, but it doesn't seem jarring at all. It completely flows. It works visually. The scenes on the island that she lives in are absolutely gorgeous, and the idea of the, I mean, this is Obayashi's Rebel Without a Cause, if you will. It's the motorcycle culture,
Hmm.
it's the youth culture, it's youth ennui, all these youth, like he doesn't know what am I doing with my time. The only thing he loves is his motorcycle. Everyone's kind of sitting around at this local bar. Also, one of my favorite, this the bar that they hang out in
It's
is like the
great.
coolest.
Yeah.
It's one of the coolest settings I've seen in a film in years, where people get up and sing. And there's beautiful music in the movie. I really liked this one a lot.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up Rebel Without a Cause because this is certainly influenced by that. It's like there are very direct influences with like the battle and stuff. But also this one made me think of Crash, right? Like the obsession with like the engines and stuff and the way that it is like an extension of his sexuality and his masculinity and stuff, right? So there are
Yeah.
all these things being broached here. And then also the red shoes, even more primarily, because
Hmm.
I know that that gives you pause for a second,
I was
but the
like, where
red
does that
shoes,
come from?
because like it's about the extreme passion and the love that he has for this thing and the way he's willing to give his whole life to it to the point where he can't accommodate other people in his life for
Hmm.
it, and down to even like the dying at the end. Like she doesn't, spoiler alert, she doesn't actually die, but it's certainly like is reminiscent of that scene where she's in the red shoes where she's running down the stairs and she eventually falls to her death and everything. I think it really is about a movie about like the space that we have for love in our lives and where we allocate that. And I
And
love
for
that
other
you,
people, right? For
yeah, and
other
for other
people.
people.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's like the maniacal nature of his love for his bike is kind of preventing him from engaging with others, and he kind of
And his love for
finds out.
himself,
And his
and the
love for
fact
himself,
that
right?
his friend, who I also adored as a character, I really liked all the characters in this one. I think this is
Hmm.
why this is one of my favorites, even more than Miss Lonely. I liked the characters. I liked the friend a lot, and how the friend really likes his first girlfriend, and he's like, "What? She's
Yeah.
like the perfect girl. What's wrong with you, dude?" Kind of like. And then when he breaks up with her horribly and the friend goes after her, I was like, oh, maybe the friend, and I even thought maybe the friend will end up with her. And then he
It's
does,
such
so
a
that made
good
me happy.
moment too. The way he's
Yeah.
like, if you don't go after her now, I will, and that's it. Like, and then it happens. Like, I love
Yeah.
that they don't dote on it and everything. And then also speaking earlier to the way you talked about the color and everything, I also really love the color in this movie. It's interesting because, like you said, there's really no rhyme or reason. And I was watching some of the extras, and Obayashi even said like each morning when we arrived on set, we would decide to use black and white or color to film on that day, irrelevant to the scenes, except for Kiwako, who would remain in all black and white. So it was random, but it creates like a great deal of visual interest, and it's great because like Obayashi again, he compares it to manga, which would have like mostly black and white for like B tier manga, or A tier manga would have all color, or there might be like black and white with a random splash of color somewhere just for like a little visual
Hmm.
intrigue or emphasis. And so he's really using it in the same way.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's actually
yeah.
kind of three colors, right? There's full color, black and white, and then he does some sepia tone type of look
Hmm.
in some sequences, especially on the island, which I
Yeah.
loved. So,
And
yeah, gorgeous movie.
Riki
Yeah.
Takeuchi, the main star in this, he's so great. This is his debut feature. He drove out to Tokyo for this. He originally wanted to call himself Riki Obayashi, but Obayashi told him to debut under his own name so that he wouldn't be stuck, like that. But
Hmm.
I love it. It's such personal filmmaking.
He's really good in it. And despite the fact at the beginning I thought it might be an ad for Kawasaki motorcycles, I ended up this one being one of my favorites of the ones we reviewed today. So we have run out of time. Thank you, Autumn. This will be our part one of 3 episodes on Obayashi. You can check out our reviews on our website, realfilmsnobs.com. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any episodes. Thank you, as always. Have a great day and great movies.
Bye.